Not really exactly sure where the SD card filled up and stopped recording, but basically what I am still working on is using my smaller brush to make sure that my sort of outline to the silhouette is as accurate as I can get it. I'm using enough water and enough pigment to sort of spread what I've got, but not necessarily enough to add a whole bunch more color or pigment at this point, because the first thing I want to do is make sure I've got the shape pretty accurate before I go in and add too much more pigment and detail. So remember, we started with sort of a black base coat, which is, like I said, a bit unusual. That's not typically the way you would start. You would not jump in instantly with with something that is dark. You would typically start with lighter layers and work your way up. But because this is more of a silhouette style, it's okay to start with something that is darker and then continue adding that value by layer and adding the detail in layers. So still, even though it is a relatively simple shape style, we are still working in layers. So I cannot stress enough the importance of working in layers and getting used to looking for how those different layers work together. So I'm going to flip my brush so I can just kind of create that sort of brush look. Because remember, we had talked about how the top of the outline here has some areas where it blends into the sky, and then other areas where it looks almost like there's a brush stroke just kind of sticking out. So I want to make sure that I capture that in there. And remember that with watercolor, when I put water back over something that is dry, like I'm doing right now, the water will reactivate the color and allow us to continue using it. So now I'm just going to go back to my bigger brush. I'm going to put a little bit more black in here. But then I'm going to also add some more of the other colors that I see. So there's quite a bit of red in this particular spot. So I'm going to go back in there while the black and other colors are still wet. And just add some of that red in. Being careful not to mess up the outline that I just created, but still trying to get close enough to it that those colors do all go right up to the edge. Now remember, when you are using watercolor, one of the challenges is that the paint does dry pretty quickly, and you don't want to put too much wet directly on top of wet, because when you keep layering with just water and whatnot, your colors, your layers will not get any darker. They'll just get wetter, and you won't be able to get more detail. So right now what I'm doing is just going back in while that added black is still quite wet, so that I can blend it directly into the silhouette that I did with the smaller brush. And notice that I am getting some lighter areas where the water is sort of picking up what is under it. That is perfectly okay. I'm actually going to leave that, because if you look at Monet's original piece, there's a lot of that in there too. So I would actually want that to happen. So now I'm going to go back in with a little bit of black here along the bottom edge, leave my page turned upside down. So you can see now where I put water, even if I have the darker down here toward the bottom, that water sort of in between the two, top and bottom areas, creates a spot for them to still be a little bit lighter and to sort of just blend together, which is exactly what his looks like. So that's an intentional blending there. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and get my smaller brush, and once again, while that area is still wet, just add a little more detail, a little more specificity to those edges that I've just sort of added color next to, so that once again I can work on making that more accurate, especially as I get into sort of the reflections in the water and the shadows that are in the water here. because you're going to want to use the right size brush once again. And on something like this, the right size brush is probably smaller than what you think. Now I am going to go ahead and continue painting very much the way that I did previously, which is kind of letting those brush strokes show the water there. And now, once again, I am looking at my original painting more than I am at the one that I am working on, so that I can start to get those colors in there in the right spots. Because there is some black in here, but there's not a whole ton of black. I'm going to go ahead and flip my page, because now I've got that part of my silhouette pretty completed. So then the next thing I'm going to be doing would be to go ahead and work into the water below. And there's a lot of red down here mixed with that blue and black. So I'm going to go ahead and just put some of that red in there. Put a little more black, a little more red, a little more blue. Remember that anywhere where I have white, which there definitely is some white mixed in here, I'm going to make sure that I don't put any color, especially not a dark color. So a lot of this red is almost just directly on top of the surface. And it does get a little bit lighter as I move towards the viewer or down the page there. And mix a little black in there, especially further towards the back, because there does seem to be more black and more blue further back than there does seem to be up front. So now some of these areas, there might be a bit of a lighter space, in which case I would want to use my sort of reverse painting technique if I need to, and press with just water into that space and lift up with a paper towel. That's a great technique for a lot of different things, and working on water is definitely one of those things. So now I'm just going to kind of connect these areas a little bit more, because the further back they go, the more they are connected. I'm still going to leave some of those lighter areas showing though, and I'm still going to allow my paint to get lighter as I move down the page. Going to add in a little bit of blue here, still leaving some of the areas white where they need to be. Bringing some of those darker areas out more up here. Same thing on this side. So that might be sort of my first layer on that part of the silhouette. I know that was more than one layer, mostly because we started out pretty dark. But it's pretty close to being finished at this point. But I would not want to necessarily add any more color or any more detail until it dries. But I will zoom in a little bit so that you guys can just kind of see how the colors all stack up there. You can see every single color in there, just like you can on the original. You can see where the water has changed the color. You can see where the black has changed the color. You can see where the colors mix and blend, so on and so forth. So then the next thing I would be doing would be to go ahead and get the forward part of the silhouette over here sort of started as well. But keep in mind, that one is actually not nearly as dark or as solid. So I'm going to use less black, more water, and a little bit of brown. And I'm going to go ahead and put a base coat on here. Once again, that is a lot lighter. Still using my big brush for now. And then this one also fades a lot more into my background. So the next thing I would be doing would be to add some more of my red and the other colors of the background in there. So that as I continue to build up those layers and whatnot, it will actually blend into the background more. And it's okay if yours doesn't look exactly like your original painting, but we do want to make sure that the idea comes across of what painting it is. So now what I'm going to do is just add a little more black, a little more brown to this area, especially towards the top here. Because then what I'm going to do is, as it is drying, I'm going to kind of blend that into sort of my sky area here. Because remember, with watercolor, a lot of what we do kind of quickly, kind of all at once, and as the paint is drying, because once that paint dries, it will affect the paper differently. And also, once the paper dries, it'll absorb the paint differently. So it's starting to get a little bit drier. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of sponge some of that in here, into that background area. Because remember, it is much softer, a more organic edge with a little bit more red in it, a little more orange down toward the bottom and middle, so that it doesn't stand out quite as much from the sky as the other silhouette that we were doing. It looks almost more cloudy and muted. So we want to make sure that that comes across in our painting as well. So now I'm going to add a little bit of orange in here, like there is in the original. And then at this point, what I would do would be go ahead and let that dry a little bit more before I do much more to that. But I am going to soften this edge between the silhouette and the water, mostly just by adding more water to it, so that they kind of blend together here. Because when we look at our original image, this is a pretty hard edge, but this part is really very soft. So then that would be the beginning of the silhouette. Again, this part of my silhouette is almost done, but then this part here needs a little bit more work, but not much more darkness, not much more saturation, mostly a little bit of reverse painting and some softening and maybe a little more blue.